All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second of three sort of tips and tricks when it comes to FRQs. Tonight, just in our literature portal, we have the three of them, poetry, prose, and then obviously the open response. So tonight we're going to be focusing on prose and what it is that we can take a look at in these excerpts. As we're getting a sense of that, however, I've opened up a poll here. What are your strengths when it comes to writing? And really the biggest strength. So pick which is your biggest strength. Do you feel that it's your ability to write a thesis and carry it through an essay? Is it your ability to pull evidence and work around that? Is it your ability to draw conclusions? Or are you really good at sort of addressing themes and recognizing that and sort of bringing that into your essay? While we're taking a look at that, please, of course, remember that this is being recorded. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. If you're joining us again, welcome. And if you're joining us on the recording, it's good to have you as well. We do encourage you to join us in the chat. I want to say hi to Gayatri, who's there, as always, helping us out, answering questions, and really just kind of keeping that community going. So it's been really, really wonderful to have y'all in that section this spring. Just remember that this stream is being recorded and your name may appear, so just be aware of that. And thank you to those. We've got a handful of responses so far in our poll question already, so I appreciate that. Of course, always join us at Think5able on our various social media, be it Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, whichever you prefer the most, or join us on all three. We love to have you everywhere. So really, keep up that great community that you've built so far over the course of this year and this season. As we get looking ahead here, our exam, the AP Lit exam, at least the first one anyway, is going to be on May 5th, which means that the evening of May 4th, hopefully we'll all get to join together here as well and start to just get through a CRAM finale. So looking forward to that. And then next week on the 27th, we're going to be working through some tips and tricks when it comes to question 3, which is, again, that really open-ended question. Two things that I want to just point out as we think on that for a moment. The work that you do tonight and the way that you think about various details, the different structures that I showed you tonight that have been kind of echoing over the course of the whole season, the important thing that you want to take away from that is to make sure that the various structures and sort of graphic organizers and all sorts of things that we're talking about, you can take those right now and start to think about books that you really care about. Start to think about each of these pieces. Obviously, that one's challenging because you don't have a ton of evidence really sort of ready at your disposal. You don't know what book's going to make the most sense to meet the question. And so to remember that the writing structures that you're going through are the same. So what we're doing tonight is the same sort of work that you can bring into your thinking when it comes to our work on FRQ3 and the work that we'll do next week together. So you just kind of keep that in mind. I don't want to get too far down the road on that, but I want to make sure that you realize that our CRAMs here are not in isolation, especially with literature, because it's all building on itself. In terms of the exposure that you're getting to various works. And as we take a look here, a lot of people seem to feel like they are really, really strong, and I'm excited to see it, with drawing conclusions and pulling evidence. I think those are two things that are super important when it comes to writing in general, and it's one of the things that I stress the most about my students. If you can look at a piece of evidence, chew on it, and talk about it, the work that you're doing is going to be really, really strong. If you're feeling a little, uncomfortable with thesis writing and making sure that carries through the actual essay, you're in luck. We're going to talk about that a little bit tonight. But if you're already at feeling confident with your evidence and with and especially with the conclusions that you draw, but in particular with the evidence, if you've got that evidence, the evidence is what's going to guide you. When we talk about trying to be, lifelong learners and research-driven people making research-driven arguments, seeing that evidence in front of us and making our arguments based on that is the important thing. It's not about writing a thesis and then proving it. It's about recognizing what you see, then writing the thesis, then proving it. So the evidence is all important right from the get-go. So it sounds like you all are in a good position in the first place. But let's see if we can't help out a little bit more with that this evening. Tonight, we're going to take a look at breaking down some various excerpts. We're going to really focus in on reading the question, and then, as I just said, preparing the essay, how it is that you want to think about kind of laying it out, and what it is that you should be taking from the reading in front of you to help you to work through the actual essay itself. As always, I want to anchor to a couple of these structures. And as I just said a moment ago, this is something that, if you grab this, you write this down. We've looked at this a lot already. If you've joined us throughout the spring, we've looked at this graphic a lot. And the reason for that is because at some point, the questions are all asking you to think about these 4 things, these 5 things, whether it be individually a plot point, as we may see tonight, as it may be some characterization, which we're going to see tonight, or if it's just how it all kind of melds into a theme. So things that you can do is to think through and take a couple of your favorite texts. So then again, this is a bit of a preview for when we focus in on FRQ3 next week, but you can be thinking about some of your favorite texts, some of the things that you've read this year, some of the things you've just read in high school, some of the things that are sort of that high level academic, classical reading that you've done even on your own, and just start to make these lists. What is going on that's important in the plot? What's important that's going on with a character? How is that character changing over the course of the text? Really just think what's going on inside, what's going on outside, what's going on in the mind. Trying to recognize various shifts in setting, and trying to make lists of any symbols. It can make it feel, this is certainly an essay, not an essay, this is certainly an exam where you can feel as though you can't quite study for it, but that's not true. You absolutely can. You can be preparing these things by thinking about all of these different topics that we talk about on a weekly basis, thinking about them in anything that you're reading, in anything that you enjoy reading, or even anything that, as I've said in the past, that you watch on TV. I was even thinking, and I don't mean to go on a tangent, but I think it's relevant here. I was even just this week watching, catching up on some of the Oscar films that are going to be ready to go on Sunday night. And I watched Nomadland. And Nomadland had me thinking about all of you because it's such a really obvious example of how you can do this kind of work just in what you're watching at any given time. Watching Frances McDermott is the lead actress. Watching her interact with different people and then constantly watching them leave. I'm not giving any spoilers away. It's in the title of the film. The really poignant commentary it gave about just human condition, human interaction, had me thinking about all the different moments that things were symbolic, things that were being passed from person to person, from nomad to nomad, things that were happening between these interactions, things that were happening repeatedly in different interactions with different people over the course of the whole film. Had me thinking about all of the things that we've talked about over the course of this spring. So maybe you're thinking about the Oscars as well, maybe you're just watching your own television shows, think about making these kinds of lists because it trains your brain to think in that way. I'm certainly sorry if I ruin movie and TV watching for you by making it so analytical, but it's good practice. I promise you it is. Let's keep going into some other work. Tonight, we're going to be looking at excerpts. And so the first thing that you want to think about when it comes to these excerpts, and this is true in the multiple choice portion of the exam, but it's also true in the actual essay writing portion of the exam. Remember that you want to work efficiently. And so this is one of those ways. The thing that's different when it comes to more important, the thing I want to emphasize when it comes to FRQ2, when you're skimming, think about skimming the second time. I tell my students to do FRQ2 first because it's the one that takes the most time. You have to spend some time reading, and you want to do that reading efficiently, but I think it's the one that takes the most time in terms of reading. When it comes to FRQ3, it's gonna really kind of stick out to you. The answer is gonna stick out to you really obviously, or it's not. You're gonna have a book ready to go that fits, or you're not. You're gonna have to spend some time thinking and outlining there. You will absolutely have something ready to go. I'm sure of that, especially if you join us next week. I'm certain that you're gonna have something ready to go. And then when it comes to FRQ1 and you're thinking about the poetry, while it's one of the most powerful pieces of writing, is at least easily digestible. It's probably pretty short form, and you're going to be in a place where you can read it pretty quickly and you can get back into it pretty quickly. And that's the point I want to make right now. When you're skimming, you want to think about skimming by going back into the piece. Give yourself the time and the space to read thoroughly on FRQ2. What that means, though, is you have to recognize that you're managing your time. You have to recognize that you've got, a pretty wide open amount of time to be able to look at all of this writing. So don't be leisurely about it. Read and try to read quickly and try to get a sense of it all. And then for the analysis, again, I don't have a graphic for it here, but we've talked about level 1, level 2, level 3 comments throughout the whole spring. Level 1, that's summary, and then level 2, the interpretations, the analysis. When you read something for the first time, you're reading it for level 1. You can't possibly pick up on foreshadowing until you've read the thing once. Right? You can sense that there's something coming. You can sense that maybe there's a harbinger, and maybe it's something that's gonna come back. The more that you read, the more you will start to pick up on those things in real time. But you can't be sure what it's foreshadowing until you actually have the opportunity to know the entirety of the story. So you can start to pick up on things, but you can't know concretely until you know everything. And so read through once, just for your own pleasure, but read through as efficiently and quickly as possible. The second time you read, however, as you start to lay out your argument, then start to skim and do this again. Think about it with these structures. And again, for those of you who are new, I'm making up the term HIPIE here. If you want to think about it like HIPIE, go for it. But you're thinking about shifts, syntax, speaker, situation, and the first and last sentence of a paragraph or an excerpt. Really, it's all about shifts. What happens from the beginning to end? How does a character change from beginning to end? When does the setting or the situation or the moment change? Are there important pieces of language that are sticking out, important sentence structure that's sticking out? And if so, so what? What can you say about that sentence in general? And so as we think through, so this is not just about skimming for the purposes of reading fast. It's about skimming for the purposes of reading for evidence. If I haven't said that throughout the spring, I wish I had. But if I haven't said it throughout the spring, the reason that I want to say it the most now is that you yourself are in control. The answers are right in front of you, and it's up to you to remember, what are you pulling out? And it's also really important to remember, and I might be getting ahead of myself here, it's also really important to remember that when you are reading an excerpt, the answer is right in front of you. So if you're reading an excerpt from your favorite book, what you know about that book needs to go away. Get excited because you've got some control over it. Get excited because you've got some command of it. But don't get so excited that you forget that you need to just focus on what's in front of you. If you know that there's some foreshadowing, you don't get to talk about it unless that moment comes up in the text in front of you. It's actually probably a little bit more challenging if you're aware of the text in front of you, because you have to be focused just on what's in front of you. That's what question 2 wants you to be able to do, is to be able to look at information that you have and ignore the other stuff that you might also know. Maybe your teacher did a phenomenal job of teaching The Great Gatsby, but if it's just asking about tension in, I believe it's chapter 7 that they go over to Tom's for lunch, and talking about how Fitzgerald creates that tension, you don't get to talk about what also happens in the hotel later on in that same chapter. You have to focus on what's happening in the living room, because that's what the excerpt has given you. So it's a double-edged sword. It's amazing that the answers are all right in front of you, but it's also a challenge to remember that the answers are just what is in front of you. So when we talk about skimming, we want to be skimming for the evidence that's in the excerpt in particular. And remember, as you're thinking through trying to recognize different patterns, what is it that you keep seeing? And once you start to see that, it can help you to answer the question. Now, you want to anchor to the question because you want to be thinking about what are the specifics that the question is asking me. As I just gave you an example, is the question asking me about how Fitzgerald builds tension, or is it talking to me about how Fitzgerald is building characterization? That doesn't mean that you can't be bringing in examples of tension to inform that characterization, but it means that you're focusing on the interactions. You're focusing on character interactions, what one character is bringing into the moment, what another character is bringing into the moment. Conversely, if it instead asks for characterization, then maybe you're focusing on some of that tension. Or if it's asking for the tension, I forget how I just phrased that, I apologize. If it's asking for the tension, you might have to bring the two characters in, whereas if it's asking for characterization, you may have to bring the tension in. I hope I've made my point on that. In any case, you want to focus in on what is the question asking you for, and then what are the various patterns for yourself? What are the patterns that you're seeing that relate to that question? And that's where that skimming for evidence and efficiency help to come in, because that's where you then get to say, okay, I see these things, I think these things, and you can say, A does B through C. Fitzgerald develops tension through body language, and you start to bring in some evidence there. Similarly, if it's an excerpt that you don't know, and it likely is an excerpt that you haven't seen before, try to read through it and do yourself a favor and try to summarize what you just read using only 9 words. 3 words, 3 sentences, 3 words each. Okay, this example here is from Things Fall Apart, and you can summarize how Things Fall Apart goes from beginning to end in any number of ways. But here again, we're trying to just challenge ourselves to be within 9 words. So, for example, Okonkwo fears masculinity. The missionaries colonize Umuofia, and then colonization extinguishes traditions. Okay? Now, I've tried not to give anything away in there, but with this example, so we can certainly say that any number of different ways. But all of that as a summary of the whole text is certainly generic, but accurate. And what that allows us to do, and I want to clarify this a little bit. I had somebody ask about this in the chat the other night when we were talking through poetry. So I want to clarify this a little bit. The reason that we do this is not to summarize in 9 words. That's not our goal. What it does is each one of these 3 teal boxes here, each one of these gives us an A does B. And that's a starting point for us, because it helps you even kind of subconsciously to recognize the things that you know how to talk about, the things that you've taken from the text. So if we want to just say Okonkwo fears masculinity, now we go back to this one. A does B through C, or A does B resulting in C. All of these words can change. Okonkwo's fear of masculinity. You don't have to tie yourself down to exactly what it is that you wrote. Okonkwo's fear of masculinity ultimately leads to the downfall of the community because 1, 2, 3. And you can start to make really nuanced thesis statements out of those just little, they're almost like fire starters, just something that's going to catch really quickly that you can then talk about. If you want to just talk about the effect of the missionaries colonizing Umuofia, the same thing happens there. Let's actually get into one here. And you can take a minute. I'm going to throw just quickly in the chat here. I'm going to try to take a moment to share that all out with you if we can, but you can certainly pull it up on a phone or other scanning device. You have this tiny URL here as well to work through. And I want you to take a moment to read through Braden's Evelyn's Visitant. And I'm going to give you a moment here to just take a look. I'm going to focus on the slide first, and then I'm going to take a moment to skim through the excerpt out loud with you. So let's just take a moment. I'm going to give you a minute to get ahead on us here and just start to sort of read through the first paragraph or two while I sort of look at some of the again, just tips and tricks that we can bring in, some of the ways to think about the question. So take a moment, pull up Evelyn's Visitant. And I'll give you a moment to be pulling that up and opening that while we take a look at the actual tips that we have here. As I say to my students, in the time allowed to you, okay, because we only have about, on the days that we do our practice writing, we only have about 40 minutes in our class. In that time, try to follow as many of these steps as possible. Something that I'll reiterate next week as well is that you can show a lot in one paragraph. Okay, I'll talk more about that later on. But the claims that you make, the evidence that you pull, all the things that we talked about at the beginning in that first poll question, the things that you pull out there can all be proven in one paragraph. Now, you missed the sophistication point, which is the thing that we'll talk about, if not next week, definitely in our CRAM finale. But you've likely seen a rubric with your own classmates and your own teachers. You can make good arguments, but if you don't have that sophistication that carries throughout the whole essay, that sophistication comes in the entirety of your argument, not just in a singular point. Okay, so making sure, in addition to a number of other factors, but you can prove a lot. Remember that we're focusing on the reader is just another English teacher. It's just someone like me who wants to give you points. They're going to give you credit for things you do well, and a single paragraph can show a lot of what you can do well, but not all of what you can do well. So just be aware of that. So in the time allowed, try to do as much as possible. Try to have a thesis that presents an interpretation and will establish a line of reasoning. Now that's going to be language. That one's not necessarily as good of a tip as you might like, but it is because that language is going to be present in the actual question, establishes a line of reasoning or something kind of similar to that language. But you want to just think, remember that a thesis is just your answer to a question. Think about the word I think, but don't actually say that, okay? What is it that you're bringing to this conversation? People forever have read this story. People forever have maybe even answered this question or a question like it. You're just adding your 2 cents into that dialogue. What do you think? Say it. Try to select evidence that's going to support that. So remember, you read it, you saw something, then you had that thesis. Now, what else can you say to prove that thesis and dive back in for that evidence? So make sure you, again, explain that relationship, and then always try to use the most accurate punctuation and grammar you can. The reader understands. The reader understands that you're in a time crunch. They understand that this is not going to be your cleanest piece of writing. And to that end, try not to self-correct in the moment. If you have a minute, you get a word wrong, you need to cross something out, go for it. But worry about going back and editing yourself and trying to restructure things at the end. Remember that you only have so much time and you're trying to allow for 3 essays. Get them all written and then go back. Some suggestions that I like to make: don't say the word literary elements, okay? That's in the question. The answer is not in the question. It's giving you a jumping off point. What sorts of literary elements can you point to? What is that complex nature? Remember that, again, if you've joined us before, I always say complex nature, that word complex or complexity or what have you, is in nearly every question. Your job is to name the complexity. Okay, what about it makes it complex? And remember, the thing that I want to emphasize the most here is that complex can be a really kind of leading word. It's a little too strong for its own good in this situation. Complex means that it's got some layers. It's got some sophistication. Your job is to name that and try to work through that. And be a little bit more, again, be more argumentative. Don't just say, in the excerpt, Evelyn is visited by materialism. You want to remember that the reader has read this excerpt as well. It's going to be a little bit different when it comes to your actual, when it comes to your Q3 and you're bringing just any old book into it. But in this case, the reader is seeing this excerpt as well. They absolutely know what it is that you're talking about. And I'll say one last thing. And again, this is a little bit more for next week, but I'll say it here. When it comes to showing what you know, it's not asking you to just regurgitate what was said in your classroom, even if the teacher that you have was able to go over this particular text or this particular excerpt. The goal is not to just show the things you know. The goal is to give credit for what you do well. That's the exact language. Credit for what you do well. So you do a lot of things well, I'm certain of it. Showcase that you can read a text and talk about it, okay? Not that you can remember things about a text and bring it into any evaluation that you're doing. Let's take a moment while I go through to I take a minute to go through the while I take a minute to go through the actual text. I want to pull up your a bit of a poll for this question in particular. I want you to just think about evidence. Again, we always want to be thinking about evidence. What can you prove? Now, you could potentially prove all of the options that I'm going to give you here. What can you prove about Hector? Okay, so the question is, how does Braden use those literary elements and techniques to convey the complex nature of Hector and Andre's relationship? So what can you prove? You could potentially say any of these. I'm sincerely asking, when I say you, I mean you, person watching this right now. What can you prove about Hector? That he's stubborn, that he's passionate, that he's impotent in that he's he's powerless, or that he is vengeful. And while you take a minute to think on that, I'm going to take a minute to talk through the actual excerpt with you. And I'm going to take a minute to talk through the things that I would think about as I'm reading this. So there's a lot of language even in this first paragraph right from the get-go that is a bit telling to us and definitely sets a tone. I will tell you, when my students worked through this a couple weeks ago, A lot of them were quick to, and this is something we had to correct in class. A lot of them were quick to focus in on the quarrel was about a woman, and they started focusing on the women as characters in this excerpt. Women play a role in this excerpt for sure, but that's not what the question's asking. So the quarrel was, in this case, about a woman. If we're skimming, if we're thinking about situation, we know at least that. But if we look at the second paragraph, right, almost immediately thereafter, I shall not name of her for love of whom Andre de Brissac and I crossed one of the bridges in the dim August dawn on the way to the waste ground beyond the church of the Saint Germain des Prés. So we haven't even named her. That's not the thing we're talking about. We're talking about what the complex relationship is. So think about what it is that we know about the characters in this in these first two paragraphs. They're in an argument, and they're cousins, and if you didn't catch it the first time around, the quarrel is fatal. Someone's dying, right? The narrator is dying. Okay, Hector is dying. Okay, my fatal. So we have at least that. And if that's not complex, I don't know what is. There's a quarrel between first cousins and one of them ends up dead. There's going to be some nuance there. Let's focus back on some of the language in the question, though. What sort of elements or techniques do we notice? Okay. Now, when we think about that, I want to always be thinking about, first off, a question like this, I want to be thinking about motivations, and I want to be thinking about syntax. Motivations is going to help to define the relationship for me. Syntax is going to help me to pick out interesting places where syntax and diction, they go hand in hand, but they can be mutually exclusive. And I say that knowing what I'm going to talk about in this particular excerpt. So I think about those two things because they're the quickest pieces that I can find of something to be able to talk about. And surely there, right in the first line of the third paragraph, we see the word vipers. That's a great word, isn't it? Okay, vipers, snakes, attacking, venomous snakes. And if we have anyone who is just a snake expert and I got that wrong, I apologize. At least when I've seen them on sports teams as vipers, they seem attacking and venomous. So there were many beautiful vipers. Now, obviously, that's a description of the women that they're trying to court in this moment, and she was one of them. That's a little pejorative here because she's this person who's going to end up in a death. Okay, the person who's inspiring that quarrel that ends up in a death, she was just, quote, one of them. But all the more reason that it sort of sets the tone. I think there is a stubbornness in here. And so therein we have the first example of our poll question here. As we skim through a little bit more, as we look through a little bit more here, we have about halfway through the third paragraph, even more vividly can I recall Andre's fair young face as he stood opposite me with his two friends, scoundrels both. And so there's some juxtaposition there, okay? Juxtaposition being, in this case, two words that are aligned so closely that their comparison is meaningful. And we see the word friends and scoundrels, in this instance, directly next to each other. I think that's poignant because it sets the tone on one word of something convivial and people coming together, and then paradoxically, it contradicts that and says, well, there were these scoundrels. And so it takes into account the fact that there is some knowledge of all of these people together. These characters know one another. They know one another probably pretty intimately. And they also, at least Hector, disregards the people around him. But it's also in a moment where Andre is being described rather beautifully, right? Fair young face, friends, and so, and even the fact that we were a strange group to be seen in a summer sunrise, all of us fresh from the heat and the clamor of the Regent saloons. He's described very well here. He's described as looking very well. As we continue through this excerpt, and again, I'm just sort of talking as I'm skimming. I hope you're reading, but I'm skimming to think through some more of this evidence here. The words fierce and quarrel and diarist and wrongs and fresh. I like this line here. The sting of my own wrongs was fresh. There is, on one hand, the same as there were friends and scoundrels, there is something lively and new, and I'm going to kind of backtrack and say young in a lot of the word choice throughout this passage. But there's also something deadly and wrong and maybe even angsty, if we want to use that sort of word. There's something immature here. So there's a lot of words that are coming to my mind in terms of, and again, I've been working through this a handful of times, but even in just this fresh reading here, I'm thinking about a lot of the connotations that come with this word choice. And so as you're thinking on this poll question, I'm thinking about these connotations. All of this comes together. He was the favorite of fortune, the favorite of women, and I was nothing. Notice that fortune is capitalized, meaning that it's being sort of deified here, being turned into a kind of god, and that he was the favorite of all women, which is something more carnal. And then again, that juxtaposition and that sudden shift to I was nothing, a rough soldier, and a mannerless boor. And so there again is this one character who reaches echelons of godliness, and another character who is even a soldier. I'm going to say bodily here, because a rough soldier, even though we might say bodily, thinking, and I said carnal a minute ago. Carnal sort of invites images of kind of intimacy and just kind of prehistoric animalistic tendencies, and to use those words when it comes to a relationship versus using those same words when it comes to a soldier, they take on different connotations, they take on different meanings, and again, that's the contrast that's happening here. We thought he was wounded. I was wounded mortally. Life had been very sweet to him, and I think that a frenzy of despair took possession of him when he felt the lifeblood ebbing away. He beckoned me to him as he lay on the ground. I went and knelt at his side. Forgive me, Andre, I murmured. And so there is so much here that does take on this contrast. And so at a minimum, when we're thinking about complex nature of a relationship and how it comes about, we want to be thinking about, we love to use the word foils. I'm not certain that it's appropriate here, but again, if you bring it in, it is something that you can do well. It does show something that you're able to recognize. I would focus on the contrasts. There's something more severe with one character and something more blessed with another character. However you want to ultimately come to that is up to you. One of the things that I want to emphasize here, though, as we take a look here, there is a vengefulness about him. And again, when it comes to all of these words, they can all be proven. But again, I want to know what you could prove. And the fact that you recognize that vengefulness is certainly a good example. So that's really, really excellent. Good job thinking about that. That's the one that I would hope that, that at least a majority of people figured out, because it does sort of stick out. And so I appreciate that. One of the things that I want you to think about in this overall, and in trying to answer this question, how does Braden, what techniques does Braden use to convey that complex nature? When you start to think about a 3x3 and start to summarize what happens here, that's going to help to reveal to you some of the words that you have at your disposal for describing that nature. You need to name the nature. You need to be able to name the complexity within that nature. So what's the relationship? What's the complexity? And so as a result, there are really three things being asked for in this question. If you're able to ultimately lean on that formulaic thesis writing structure of A does B because 1, 2, 3, there's a lot of places you can start. A could be Braden. A could be Hector. A could be Andre. It doesn't necessarily matter. It matters what it is that you noticed to be able to talk through that structure, and then fill in the 1, 2, 3, making sure you're, again, and I said this a little bit if you were with us for the poetry CRAM. You want to make sure that each of your paragraphs is in some way touching on at least one of those questions. Are you defining the relationship? Are you talking about that complexity? Are you talking about Braden as an author? And are you able to do even more than one of those things in a given paragraph? Can you bring your own complexity to your own writing? Let's talk about another one here. And as we think through how you bring that in, think about some other evidence. So I told you when we were reading through that last excerpt, I told you that I was thinking about syntax and diction. One of your best friends, in particular on this question, is probably going to be a solid organizer. Thinking about syntax, which we just talked about, organization would have come into that last question as well, but it'll come into the next one as well. That's why I sandwich in between these two. Organization is going to matter because you're thinking about, again, as I said this earlier, you're thinking about shifts. What's changing over the course of the text? Where is it changing? And how is any sort of language, be it interesting syntax or connotative diction, which one is helping to indicate that shift? Level of language we've mentioned before, but level of language in the last one is at times sophomoric. We want to think about levels of language in terms of context. So we don't want to say that that language was super high just because it was older language and it wasn't particularly modern and maybe it didn't feel as common and colloquial and approachable. But that doesn't mean that the level of language is high. The level of language in that moment had an air of, had a juvenile air to it, had a sophomoric air to it. Maybe it was vengeful in moments. We talked about some of the connotations that I had. Think about the connotations you had. What words define that for you? Obviously, I said diction, but let's just think of imagery and details. Imagery, we know, is language that uses the senses. It shows distinction. So even the connotation between friend and friend and scoundrel. Scoundrel is not an example of imagery, but it is a word that shows a gradient. It shows some level of how evil that person is. They may not be truly evil. They're just not particularly trustworthy. There's something different in the level there. Details are what else do we learn in the passage? What's going on in the rest of the passage? And even the, just the fact that we know that they're cousins would have been important. Additionally, you may have even seen soapstone if you're maybe in an A-push class or elsewhere. I know that I've mentioned it a few times in here. But thinking about what's the subject, the occasion is another way to think about it, but that's just the situation that's going on at any given time. So if we're thinking about even how we skimmed a minute ago, situation helps there as well. Who's the intended audience? We can likely skip through that sort of work. Who's speaking would have been important in that last one. Hector was the narrator, and so what we know about Hector and what we know about him as character comes through in his perspective. And what are the tone words that are kind of triggering that tone for us? But I would lean the most on solid in that moment. Let's take a look at The Rise of Silas Lapham by William Dean Howells. You can again see this QR code here. You can see that tiny URL for you, and some new suggestions here, some new tips and tricks. You likely want to consider, again, when we see this language like you may wish to consider such literary elements as style, tone, and selection of detail. Let's stop and recognize that instruction in the instructions. Like I said a moment ago, the question is not going to give you the answer. It's just going to give you a jumping off point. And so what I really like about this question is that all of the questions are telling you what to think about, but they're not necessarily telling you what to talk about. In this moment, if I see style, tone, and selection of detail, I know that I have two organizers in my head, soapstone and solid, that both echo selection of detail and tone. Now, that doesn't mean that, if you choose to just think through soapstone, that you can't talk about the selection of details. These organizers, these mnemonic devices, are meant to be things that help you to stay anchored and efficient and focused during the test. If you recognize these things on your own and you just want to make a list, that's fine. That's going to end up counting as an outline for you if you just list off style, tone, and selection of detail. The thing that makes that a little bit challenging for yourself is that you could write the whole essay on the stylistic elements. You could write a whole essay on the tonal elements. You could write a whole essay on the details. The important piece is to remember the question, so what? If you start to talk about the tone in any given moment, ask yourself, so what? And make sure that you're telling the reader, so what? I noticed this. What is important about that? Okay. So as you can see, I've just sort of, waxed poetic or nostalgic or maybe even a little idiotic on the sub bullet points here. May means that it's just giving you the examples. It's not going to give you the answer. Focus on what the author is doing. And as always, okay, here's that word complex again. Name the complexity and make that outline. Okay, take a moment to take a look through Silas Lapham, and while you're thinking through that, think again, what can you prove? Okay, what can you prove about the interactions? Can you prove that one is sociable while the other is cloistered? Can you prove that they're both cloistered, but they're okay with it? They're happy? Can you prove that their isolation is actually intolerable? Can you prove that they're thriving in the community? The question here being to write an essay that analyzes how the author portrays the complex experience of two sisters, Penelope and Irene, within their family and society. So as you're taking a look, and I'm going to ask you, I'm just going to sort of talk kind of off my head here about this excerpt a little bit more. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this question because I want to give you some time to look at it. But I also want to move on a little bit just to make sure that we get through 3 excerpts. I always expect to get through 3, but keep a 4th one on hand just in case. Let's see if we can't get through 3 this evening. Thinking through this essay, as hopefully you've been reading through while we've been talking, but if you're not, just taking a look now. Just look at the question first. There's a lot in here. The same way that we looked at 3 things that we wanted to talk about in the last question, here I actually see 4. Write an essay that analyzes how the author portrays. So there's the 1. What is the author doing? The complex experience. What is the complexity? There's 2. Of 2 sisters. So now we need to know each of these characters in terms of their characterization, in terms of their various interactions with each other and with their family and society. So it's their interactions with each other, it's who they are as characters, it's their interaction with each other as family members, it's their interaction with the rest of the family, and then it's that family's interaction with society. We have a ton to unpack here. That's why we need to take a minute to stop and listen to and anchor ourselves in what we know we can look for. So thinking about those details, what are the details that you're noticing? Details that you're noticing is going to help to give you some evidence. You can also remember, we've talked in the past, and we'll talk in a moment, about tales language. Thinking about a character in terms of what they think, how they act, how they interact, what they look like, and what they say. We might not necessarily get into their heads, but we will get into their speech, and we can get a sense of what they believe in this excerpt as well. So to look at this, we could again just sort of anchor ourselves to think what's going on inside, what's going on outside, and what's going on in their belief system. That's going to be important for our characterization here as well. And first off, I want to just point out that we have in our Google Doc for people who have joined in, I have on my end an anonymous dragon, which is just awesome, and it's a great little avatar too. But let's take a minute to look through each of these excerpts. And again, this might be one that you need to skim over a couple of times, recognizing that there's only maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs here, thinking about what is revealed to us over the course of the paragraph, over the course of the excerpt, thinking about what is changing over the course of the excerpts. And when we think about selection of detail, we can also be thinking about those characters. So right from the get-go, they were not girls who embroidered or abandoned themselves to needlework. Irene spent her abundant leisure time in shopping for herself and her mother, of whom both daughters made a kind of idol. Now there's an interesting bit of syntax. Even for the time period, I think it's an interesting piece of syntax. It catches you by saying, of whom both daughters, of whom being the mother, of whom both daughters made a kind of idol. Another way to say that is just they idolized their mother. They wanted to follow in what she did. So we want to think of, and they tried to dote on her as well. Irene dressed herself stylishly, and so we know that she is someone who is present in the times. All 3 took long naps every day and sat for hours together, minutely discussing what they saw out of the window. So they are people who are inside, okay? They're kind of indoor cats, not outdoor cats. They are not going out to socialize too much, but they're still putting on a lot of style for people who are not leaving a lot. And so that's important. Irene complained that Penelope, she scared away young men whom they got acquainted with at the dancing school socials. So there were times that they go out, but even when they're going out, they're kind of scaring other people away. And so all of this is to say that as we're reading through this excerpt, all of this are examples of places where we're getting a great deal of detail just in terms of the characters. So we don't actually need to know anything about this story. And if you do, again, awesome. But this is one of those places where you're really, really challenged to not bring more into it. Focus just on what's in front of you, because that's going to be the important thing. And it seems like we're getting, again here, that they're cloistered, but they are happy, okay? You could likely make an argument, again, for any of these. I would say if there is a right answer here, though, it is this one, that they are shut themselves off, but by their own choice. Let's take a moment to just look at one last piece before we wrap up for the evening. I mentioned this at another time. As we think through various excerpts, we want to remember, this might be something, again, that you saw in the 5th grade, but it's still important in terms of recognizing details and answering the question, so what? Remember that conflict is not necessarily a problem in the way that we might say it, that maybe I'm in a fight with my friend. That's not necessarily what we mean by conflict. Conflict is just the problem, the driving force of the story. What is causing anything to happen? And in this story, as we look at One Amazing Thing by Miss Diva Crooney here, we want to think, we're analyzing how Diva Crooney uses literary elements and techniques to convey Miss Pritchett's complex reaction to the events of the day. So where we've seen complex relationship all the time, even in a completely different question, they've managed to put the word complex in here. So take a look, skim through Miss Pritchett's kind of interactions throughout the day. I'll take a moment, and what I want you to focus on as we take a look here, how does Mrs. Pritchett change over the course of the text? Okay, even if you're taking a look at the gift down in the corner, this might be a SpongeBob episode that's more my childhood than your childhood, but Squidward goes and finds a place where he's perfectly content. He's perfectly happy, everything that's there for him. As he's changing, so too is Miss Pritchett. How does she change? From doting to selfish? From content to complacent, from successful to meek, or from controlling to empowering? What do you believe? What I think is really interesting about the start of this passage is that fateful day, much like we saw the word fatal a moment ago. That fateful day begins with Miss Pritchett enjoying a cup of lemon tea in her morning kitchen. It's a very pleasant scene. If we're skimming a little bit and looking at the first and last sentences of each paragraph, the bowl is filled with apples and pears and her husband's favorite fruit. She's done something here for her husband. She's decorated the house in that manner. Mrs. Pritchett has sent her husband off to his office on a wholesome breakfast of oatmeal with almonds and brown sugar and a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. Now, already this seems like a more modern piece of writing. Don't let that help or hurt you, okay? It's accessible. That's all you need to know. That's all you necessarily need to care about. It's, you can have some confidence there. But you should have that same confidence in any of our other writing, because it all is something that I think if you keep yourself grounded, will be able to anchor to, and you'll recognize interesting word choice. If we're skimming, we might see some interesting words in terms of luxurious. We also see some syntax in terms of the parenthetical. This need for rest would have irked her when she was younger. She accepts it with equanimity now. Then it'll be time to prepare for dinner, an easy task. The lamb has already been marinated and the greens washed and patted dry. So this large paragraph here is likely a description of her day, even just from reading the first and last sentence here. And obviously we know as we look back into it, it is. Then a very short sentence. If we're thinking about organization, that's important. So a very short paragraph here. Now that's not always as important outside of poetry, but it is meaningful here. It does not strike Miss Pritchett that her life is small and contained, filled with bourgeois pleasures. If it did, she would not consider that a bad thing. So small and contained in a paragraph that itself is small and contained. And as many of you might have just noted, bourgeois pleasures is a great bit of diction to chew on. You can write a whole paragraph about that. You could probably write a whole essay about it. In fact, I suspect you would. As we look through, we see this next paragraph where she recognizes a small couple that have grown old together. And that last sentence, one day soon, she and her husband will come to this. She gets moved by the actual couple and the way that the husband is compassionate towards the wife. We've already seen this moment of intimacy from Miss Pritchett to her husband, but not the other way around. We instead see it in this elderly couple. As we skim through, as we take a look at the end, because I recognize I'm taking a look at the time here. Throughout the book club, Miss Pritchett can't stop thinking about the couple in the cafe. In her distracted state, she forgets to bring up her best points during the discussion. So even in her planned moments, she gets thrown off the rails. She's a little out of sorts. She's a little kind of off her game here. By the time Mr. Pritchett returns from the office, she has made a decision. After dinner, when the men swoon over her trifle and the women clamor for the recipe, which she writes down for them on a monogram note card, all of these really, again, bourgeois pleasures, she tells Mrs. Pritchett that she has a terrible headache. Would it be okay if she slept in the guest room? He agrees easily, as she knew he would. So there's very little compassion on the one end. We've got two characters here. We've got Mr. Pritchett that we can make a character of here, even though we see him very little in this. And we can think through all of those other pieces together. And in fact, I might say there's probably content to complacent as one of our examples here. We can do a lot there. And I don't mean to, again, I don't mean to jump ahead for us here, but I do want to kind of put a thumbtack in our work here tonight. And I hope that you'll join us for FRQ3 next week as well. But we went through this work. Again, the things that we would have just gone through in a moment is a little bit of over planning on my part, and that tails chart that I mentioned a moment ago. In terms of just crushing question 2, because again, the answer's in front of you, and I'm certain that you're going to be able to pull that good information. You said at the beginning that you have some strength with evidence, and that's the most important thing. So read and reread. You're skimming for purpose. You're skimming for evidence. Okay? Use the question as a guidepost for yourself. Think about all the characters that are brought up in the questions. Think about all the characters that are available to you, and think about their motivation. Find what the character wants and how it's going to drive that scene. Okay, think about what the character is maybe also missing. The opposite can be true. Not necessarily what they want, but also what they're missing. Remember that conflict is not just the problem of any sort of piece of writing or any scene. Conflict is just the thing that people are driving towards. Okay, they don't necessarily have to be angry at each other, even though conflict sort of connotes anger. They don't have to be angry. They just need to be moving towards something. Okay, and take the time to read. Take the time to outline. Okay, what is it that the question wants, and make sure that you're touching on on some or all of that in each paragraph that you write. I hope tonight was helpful. If it was, be sure to shout out Five. I'm sure all of these CRAMs have been really, really super helpful for you all. There are a talented group of instructors out there, and you are a talented group of students. So make sure to just keep building that and shouting each other out at Think Fiveable, and keep that community going on Discord. Make sure to keep these questions going. We would have taken a look at an excerpt from The Lamp of Psyche, which I know can be an AP class staple and an AP class favorite. So if you want to keep talking about that, or you want to keep talking about Miss Pritchett's reactions to the day, feel free to do that in Discord, and anything else that you might be able to bring up. It is, as always, wonderful having you all, and I appreciate your time here this evening. I look forward to talking to you again in the next 2 weeks. Have a good evening, all.